I found that especially Riel, but a lot of the leadership in 1869 and 1870, which was the first Riel Rebellion, the Red River Resistance, Métis were talking about creating a treaty with Canada. And so the Manitoba Act, which created the province of Manitoba, which the Métis intended it to be a Métis province, was actually the product of a treaty relationship, a long treaty negotiation that agreed between Cartier and Macdonald as well as Métis representatives, particularly Abbé Richaud, who was a French priest that was kind of trusted by the Métis, negotiating on behalf of them. And so Canada, through the House of Commons, and the Métis through the Legislative Assembly of Assiniboia, actually ratified the treaty. And so it was used in terms, they talked about it in that era as a treaty, but now it's kind of seen as a unilateral act of legislation. So as if the federal government just created a new province to appease the Métis, rather than it being a bilateral agreement between two equal political polities negotiating with one another to create a different type of political relationship. The relationship envisioned in the 19th century, probably by both Canada and definitely the Métis, is something very different than it is now. And so what I want to look at is how was that relationship conceived in the 19th century, and what relevance does that have today? Obviously, if there's a treaty relationships are binding under international law, and therefore Canada would have to pursue a very different relationship with Métis than it has today, which is typically the federal government denies responsibility for Métis people. In that kind of paternalistic way, they deny that they have to provide services or funding for Métis people, that they need to negotiate with Métis people, and they tend to download all of that responsibility onto the province. And so what you have are several provinces trying to, create a relationship with Métis people, while the Métis organizations are largely confined to provincial politics rather than the nation-to-nation relationship that was originally agreed upon. Non-Indigenous students, I would encourage to take IS 200, Indigenous Studies 200, the introductory course. It's a fantastic introduction to Indigenous issues and to learn. I think this is going to be a major political issue for Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people in the future. The relationship between Canada and Indigenous nations. You can see that on the West Coast. You can see that, with the pipeline, whether that's down here or it's up north in the Mackenzie Valley. Those are going to be major political issues. The tar sands, all of these things directly affect Indigenous people, and Indigenous people are increasingly uncomfortable with that kind of exploitation on their territories. And so as we go forward, these issues are going to need to be resolved and reconciled in some way. And I think non-Indigenous people have, an opportunity here to learn what those issues are, first of all, and the Indigenous side of the story. Learning the past and learning that treaty relationships are two-sided agreements in which all of us are a part of, and that those places without treaties should aspire to treaties. And I'm not talking about the BC treaty process or any of that kind of colonial nonsense. I'm talking more about like a real treaty in the sense where people sit down, agree to live together, and agree on the circumstances in which we can live together, and we won't try to steer each other's canoe, as they say on the East Coast, or to colonize or to exploit, and to just live in a better way together. I think those are the types of relationships, those types of old style treaties, which all the original treaties take that form. Those are the kinds of things that we need to get back to, as opposed to the status quo, because right now, it's just not working for people. And so to imagine something different. And so I would encourage Indigenous students, non-Indigenous students alike, to learn. We've got resources here. And learning does not often mean just start showing up at cultural events, but to learn the history, to learn kind of what's behind these types of relationships. And